Hey there everybody, Sage Popham here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, and I'm sitting here in my newly established writing zone in the Evolutionary Herbalism classroom where I have been working on my book. And I know some of you may have heard the big news that I am currently working on my very first book that is scheduled to be published by North Atlantic Books in around this time next year, 2019. And this is very exciting news, and I'm very happy to be finally sitting down to finish this book that I have been working on and writing and thinking about for like 6 or 7 years now. And I was sitting here and I was, thinking about all of you and really wanting to share some things with you on the blog here and on the podcast. And I was trying to think of some content to share with you. And I was like, oh, I'm writing this book. I should bring you along the journey of the book. And so this being our first official new blog post and podcast of 2018, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the book and the vision that I have behind this book and what I'm trying to put together, the different pieces of the puzzle that I'm putting together in this book that is tentatively going to be called, as you might guess, Evolutionary Herbalism. And maybe once a week or a couple times a month, shoot a video like this and just share with you a little bit about what I'm writing about that week. I thought it would be kind of fun to bring you all along my writing journey and share with you some of the insights that I'm having in my own life as an herbalist and the ways that I'm trying to encapsulate that vision in language and the feeling and the experience of my work with plants, and to anchor it down into lingual form so that when you hopefully someday read the book when it comes out, that vision and that feeling and that my vision and understanding of plant medicine can reach off of that page and touch your heart and touch your mind and give you some of that feeling and some of that vision that is at the root of my work with plant medicine. So I'm really excited to be working on this book. It's been long overdue, and it's a huge project. And it's been really, really fun to be hunkered down up here in the classroom and to take this time and the space to work on it. So, the overall framework for the book is what I refer to as the 5 pillars of evolutionary herbalism. For those of you that have been following me for a while, you've probably heard me talk about these pillars before, but it's been really neat to dig into each one of those pillars in more detail, because you got a lot of real estate with the book, and I can share a lot more in a book than I can in a 15, 20, or even 60-minute video with you here. So that first pillar and that first section of the book that I've been working on a lot is the light of nature. And currently, there's about 4 chapters in that section, and what I've been talking about in that section so far is really looking at nature as an intelligence, right? That everything about a plant is intelligence, that plants are a physical embodiment of an intelligent life force that expresses through all layers of the plant, through its habitat, through its growth dynamic, its morphology, its shape, its color, its texture, to its medicinal properties and the way that we work with it therapeutically. All of those aspects within a plant are a language, are a communication. And it's been interesting digging into some other writers and some other books that really speak of this dynamic of intelligence within nature, and specifically intelligence within plants. And thinking about it, our culture has in a way kind of indoctrinated us on through our education, through our culture, through science, through all the ways that our modern culture kind of impresses upon us certain perspectives, certain ways of seeing the world. And I think one of the core perspectives that we have been given, unfortunately, is that intelligence is a quality that is distinctly relegated to human beings. And this goes really, really deep in Western philosophy. I mean, all the way back to Plato and Aristotle and Greek philosophy, where oftentimes we would see these diagrams showing the hierarchies of life, with, of course, humans at the top and oftentimes plant life at the bottom of the rung of that evolutionary ladder, so to speak. And this is unfortunate because it has impregnated our minds with a mode of cognition and perception that sees plants as unintelligent because they don't move around or they don't have a brain. And I say that in quotes because in fact plants do have brains. It just doesn't exactly look like our brains. And but what we see really in the modern science, before I get into that, I want to say the thing about that is that when we deem nature as unintelligent, when we see the botanical kingdom as lacking consciousness, lacking perception, lacking intelligence, we kind of see them as these dumbed down forms of life, all of a sudden we are above it, and that gives us, in a way, we give ourselves that permission to dominate, control it, see it as a resource for our own benefit, as opposed to seeing the botanical kingdom as an integral part of life. I mean, every breath that we take is utterly dependent on the plant kingdom. Plants are regulating the whole biosphere of Gaia. And without plants, we don't exist. And so there's this dynamic where we have to integrate almost like a moral standard that encompasses plants, right? That when we think of morality, of what is good, like what is a baseline appropriate action for us to take as human beings, oftentimes moral action is only placed within the context of our relationship to other human beings. And of course, over the last number of decades, through the animal rights movement and things like that, we've started to integrate, broaden our moral definitions to encompass the animal kingdom more, right? And to think about our actions that we take and their impacts on the animal kingdom. But oftentimes the plant kingdom is ignored in that. And there's some really great books out there kind of speaking more to the philosophy around plants and human relationship with plants and how we interact with the natural world, that is calling for humanity to integrate plants into our moral standards. And that has implications in science, in medicine, in politics, in industry, right? That we have to start thinking about the impacts our actions have on the plant kingdom, and whether, right? So it's like, if you think about it, if we have a moral standard that encompasses plants, all of a sudden we can't go into the Amazon and destroy and plow down thousands of acres of rainforest to graze cattle, right? We can't go into old growth forest and just clear cut the whole thing to make it into cardboard and paper and lumber, right? It's like, if we see the nature as intelligent and we see ourselves as an integral part of nature, then all of a sudden our whole relationship with it completely changes, and a lot of the ways in which we've been relating to nature have to change. And so there's this bigger kind of thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately in regards to just this baseline human perception of plants. Like, how do we see plants? How do we relegate them in terms of their importance? And do we really honor them? Do we really respect them? Do we really have a moral standard for them? Are we really considering them in our actions and in our activities and how we relate to the world? And this dynamic of plant intelligence is really, really fascinating. There's been a lot of research showing that plants actually have the same sensory faculties that we as human beings have, right? That plants actually have a sense of sight, they have a sense of smell, they have a sense of touch, they have a sense of taste, they actually have a sense of hearing, even though they don't have eyes like we do or tongues like we do. They still have these sensory faculties. And one of the interesting differentiations between humans and plants that kind of split us in terms of our evolutionary pathways is that plants opted for a stationary lifestyle, whereas animals opted for movement, right? That we have arms and legs or wings or ways of moving that allows us to hunt for food and gather different things and interact with our environment in an incredibly different way than plants do, right? Because plants, for the most part, are stationary. Obviously, they move through growth and things like that, but it's on a much longer time frame than the dynamic movement of the animal kingdom. So the plants developed very different forms of sensory perception than that of animals. And the thing that's really interesting about plants is that basically their organ systems, so to speak, are equally distributed throughout their entire organism, right? So if we look at it like a human, right, that you can't take out like someone's brain and they still be able to live. You can't remove a liver and someone can still be alive, right? That you can't really take out any of our organs and expect us to function optimally or even to live through that, right? I mean, that should make sense. So we have very specific organs that have very specific physiological functions that maintain the health of the organism. Plants, on the other hand, have their organ systems, in a sense, evenly distributed throughout their entire being, right? And this is an evolutionary mechanism, right? I mean, they're stationary. So if, for example, if a particular physiological function is solely dependent on one part of a plant, and say a deer comes up and eats that part of the plant, then the plant would die, right? But plants have evolved this capacity to distribute their vital force and distribute their physiological functions that keep them alive evenly throughout the entire organism, right? They're like a fully organized unit that has their functioning equally distributed throughout them. So when that deer comes up and munches all the leaves of the plant, well, that plant is still going to be able to photosynthesize, probably not as well. It's still going to be able to produce all of the compounds that it needs to produce to protect itself, etc. And this dynamic is very interesting because we see many plants have very sensitive sensory perceptions to their environment and can actually transform their chemistry in response to environmental perturbations. So for example, there are certain plants that when a particular pest, like a bug, lands on the leaf of that plant and starts munching away on the leaves, that plant can read the saliva and read what type of insect it is, and then start to produce particular compounds that will inhibit that pest, right? It starts secreting bitter compounds or aromatic compounds that will deter that pest, right? Other plants have an even more kind of fascinating mechanism where they will actually secrete aromatic compounds and disperse them into the air that are an attractive mechanism for another kind of bug that eats the bug that's eating the plant, right? So rather than the plant inhibiting the bug on its own, it's actually signaling for the predator for that bug to come in and destroy it. But where it gets even more fascinating is that these plants can actually secrete these volatile aromatic compounds into the air, into the atmosphere, which then the other plants in the immediate area receive those compounds, register them, and they start to produce those compounds as well. So we see nothing in the forest is in isolation. Everything in nature is this grand orchestrated communication. That everything is a language. One of the other interesting aspects of plant intelligence is, and this was actually a concept that was developed and researched in depth by Charles Darwin. We tend to think of Darwin just as, in regards to his work of the evolution of species, which is incredible work. And by the way, just a little side note here, most of what we think of as Darwinian philosophy isn't really what Darwin was saying. And this is very, very common that we see amongst great scientists, is that after they die, certain people take a small fraction of their work and magnify it, take it out of context from the rest of their work, and kind of turn it into something else that it's not. And one of the things with Darwin is that he was actually an incredible botanist. I mean, he studied plants in incredible depth. And one of the things that Darwin was very interested in was the root structures of plants. And in fact, the roots of plants are oftentimes equated as the plant brain, right? That there's literally neurochemicals that are similar to our own neurotransmitters, basically serotonin-like compounds within plants that govern their whole neurological system. Now, a lot of scientists would argue, well, plants don't have neurons, so it's not a nervous system. But that's because we're just comparing it to people. But if we look at the actual function and the way in which the root systems and the way plants communicate within themselves, we see that it's incredibly similar to that of the human nervous system. And the roots of plants literally kind of are a fractal pattern that they bend and twist and fold and kind of create these wave dynamics in order to increase their surface level, their points of contact with the soil. And we see that roots have the capacity to actually read the quality of the soil. They can analyze the nutrient content of the soil. Say the plant is deficient in a particular nutrient, and that nutrient is over here. Well, those roots can sense that and will start to grow in that general direction. They can also sense where water is. When there's a deficiency of water, the roots can analyze where water is within the soil and start growing in that direction. This is another really cool way plants communicate within themselves, is that the roots and the leaves of the plant are in constant communication. And one of the ways they do that is for the preservation of water. So within the leaves of plants, this is the basis for photosynthesis, right? Where plants are taking in sunlight and carbon dioxide and transmuting it into energy, right? Into energy and into physical structure, sugars, right? Carbohydrates, essentially, as the basis of material life, essentially here on Earth, and obviously oxygenating the planet, as oxygen is one of the primary byproducts of photosynthesis. And the parts of the plant that do this are what are called stomata. They're almost like the pores of the skin that we have. The stomata will open up in the leaves in order to receive more sunlight, in order to process it into viable energy and sugars for the plant. Now, the thing about the stomata, though, is that when they open, there's a certain degree of evaporation of water that's happening within the plant. And so there's this dynamic communication happening between the roots and the leaves, whereas if the whole plant if the roots are becoming dried out, there's a lack of water, the roots will send signals to the leaves basically saying, hey, we're dry, and the stomata will close even during optimal times of day with a lot of sunlight where the plant can photosynthesize very well, those stomata will close in order to preserve the water element as those roots will start to seek out particular water sources within the soil. Conversely, if the leaves or the rest of the plant is deficient in any particular mineral, it will send that signal down to the roots, and the roots will then begin to seek out that particular nutrient within the soil. So in a way, it's like the roots are tasting the soil, looking for particular nutrients that they need. They have an incredible sensitive quality to them, and in that way, the roots are seen as the plant brain. So this is just some of the stuff that I've been learning about myself personally in undertaking this study of plant intelligence. And it's like our educational system is always decades behind the modern science, and it's just incredible the level of research that has happened out there based on plants and their sensory faculties, their awareness, right? It's like the only way that a plant can have these levels of communication is if they have an awareness of their surroundings, right? That we tend to think of plants as like, oh, they're just this like, well, not us because we're all herbalists, but the culture as a whole typically thinks of a plant as like, it's just sitting there in the ground and whatever, it's just doing its thing. It's not really intelligent. It's not really dynamic. It's not really communicating to its surroundings, but actually there's this incredibly dynamic communicative quality happening within the natural world. So it shows that these plants are aware. They're aware of their environment. They're also aware of self and non-self, right? That when those bugs come and start eating the plant, it says like, oh, there's something wrong here. This is affecting my safety in a sense, and we don't want that to happen. And so it crafts an intelligent response to deter that pest. So it has an awareness of self and non-self. Therefore, plants have a sense of identity, right? This is not commonly a quality that humans ascribe to the plant kingdom. We don't think of them as individuals. We don't think of them as being sentient or conscious, right? And the important thing to me as herbalists, for us, is to recognize that first off, that plants are intelligent, that plants are in communication with the other plants, with the mycorrhiza in the soil, with the fungi, with the birds, with pollinators, with insects, with, the soil, and they all are this self-organized system that creates an ecosystem, right? That all of the natural world is in communication with itself. But we're a part of that natural world too, right? That humans are as much a part of nature as the plants and the birds and the animals and the fungi and anything else in nature. We're a part of that too. And, one thing I really go on in this first section, The Light of Nature, is how, there's this core illusion that human beings are carrying that sees us as separate from nature, and that we've created this whole world that is separate from the earth. And in the creation of that world, that we have located our consciousness predominantly in the intellect, in the mind, in reductionism, in linearity. And when we observe nature, we see that nature is in fact not reductionistic, not linear. It cannot be fully grasped and understood in its totality through analysis, through the brain and the intellect. And so this creation of the world has separated us from the earth. We've removed ourselves from the council of relations that is at the crux of nature and at the basis and foundation of life. And so this first section really is a calling. It's a calling for us as humans to return back to that council of relations, to return to this communicative relationship with the natural world. And I think this is a critical aspect of herbal medicine because, the first herbalists in the world weren't taught from books. They weren't taught from universities. They certainly did not have Google, right? They learned from the plants themselves. And And because everything in nature is in flux, everything in nature is changing, it's like the only unchanging thing is change itself. And the world is changing, people are changing, and I think our medicinal plants are changing right along with it, right? And while it's great to study our traditions of herbal medicine, our folk traditions and medical traditions from the East and the West and the North and the South and all across the globe, in order to understand our medicinal plants, I believe it's important for us to not let that get in the way of our own direct relationship with the plants, that we learn to generate the quality of perception within our own hearts to receive that intelligent communication from plants. And we all have this innate ability. It's not like some sort of esoteric, spiritual, mystical thing that you have to be psychic or you have to be clairvoyant or whatever to communicate with plants. It's actually a very straightforward process where it just has to do with us getting out of our heads and getting into our hearts. And unfortunately, the pathway from the head to the heart is incredibly cluttered in the modern human being. And this first section in the book, The Light of Nature, is really a calling to return back to our hearts as a primary organ of perception, and that through our hearts we have this ability to engage in a co-creative relationship, in a communicative relationship with the dynamic intelligence of plants. And through that we can learn the medicine of the plants from the plants themselves. And I believe this is very important because the modern human organism is experiencing all sorts of sicknesses and diseases and health problems that didn't exist 100 years ago, right? Think of, it's like I think of, this new generation of children coming into the world that, are raised staring at an iPhone, surrounded by Wi-Fi signals, that are eating nothing but genetically modified processed foods, that are completely disconnected from the natural world, whose feet never touch the livingness of the soil, right? Whose eyes only perceive the squares and right angles and straight lines of the Euclidean geometry of cities, whose ears only hear the sounds of sirens and traffic, whose smell only the smell of exhaust and paint and other byproducts of industry, right? That their whole sensory organism is disconnected from the reality of the natural world, from the earth. And that I believe that we're going to see, that we are seeing now, and that we are going to see in the years to come, a spectrum of illness and disease manifest within the human being that we've never seen before. And Paracelsus, the great alchemist and physician, said, for every disease that exists on this earth, there is an herbal medicine that grows to heal it. And I probably didn't say that quote exactly correctly, but you get the gist of it, right? That our plants are changing, right? Our plants are aware of what's going on this Mother Earth, right? That the plants are, a subpart of this greater intelligence that is the earth itself, right? That Gaia, the earth, is itself an intelligent, self-regulating organism, and that is in communication to her subparts, being plants as well as being people. And in this way, the plants themselves are changing, their medicines are changing, but the only way that we're going to be able to understand those new properties of the plants is if we're relating to them, is if we're listening to them, is if we're cultivating the necessary mode of perception and cognition that opens us up to hearing their unique dialect, their unique diction, their own particular language that we have the ability to comprehend and understand. But we have to learn to get out of that intellect and down more into the intuition that dwells within our hearts. And I'll probably do some more videos in the coming weeks talking more about that. In chapter 2, I go in a lot of depth on the heart. I'm calling that chapter Gnosis Cardiaca, which is the knowledge or the wisdom of the heart. And that, we tend to think of the brain as the main center of consciousness, but in fact, consciousness is universally distributed throughout the body. And it has a central focus, yes, in the brain, but also within the heart, as well as within the solar plexus, these three main areas of nervous system concentration, and that we have this capacity to actually think with our heart, right? Which is a very different kind of thinking than we think in our brain and in our minds. So I'll do some other videos in the future talking about this dynamic of the heart as an organ of perception, and how the heart has the ability to read into the subtle frequencies of the plants, that electromagnetic emanation of the plant, which contains, as all electromagnetic fields contain, communication and information. So I just wanted to share a little bit about my book here. I know I'm kind of rambling. I'm just free for alling this video. I don't have any notes or anything, and that's probably how I'll do these videos. Just kind of share a little bit with you what's on my mind and what's on my heart and what I'm writing about, and just to bring you along the journey in the development of my book, Evolutionary Herbalism. And for me, ultimately, this book is really a vision. For me, it's a vision that has been developing and unfolding for a very long time for me now. And it's like visions can be very sometimes nebulous and hard to explain and share and describe. But ultimately, the vision for this book is a reorientation of our understanding of herbal medicine. This is not a book that goes into, what types of diseases or symptoms herbs are good for. I'm actually not even really doing a whole lot of materia medica in the book. It's really a philosophy book, right? The holistic philosophy of plant medicine, in the way that we can integrate the spiritual aspects of plants with the physical healing properties of plants, and really showing kind of this universal pattern within plant medicine, right? So being able to look at what are the universal principles amongst herbal traditions across the world. Like what's behind Ayurveda? What's behind Chinese medicine? What's behind alchemy? What's behind Western herbalism? Like what was the guiding force that showed these traditional people how to create their system of medicine, how influence their understanding of plants, and how do we bring that together in our modern world, right? How do we integrate tradition with modern science? How do we integrate the health of our bodies with the health of our minds and the health of the soul? How do we have a system of herbal medicine that equally addresses our physical health and well-being, as well as the evolution of the soul and the development of consciousness, right? That's really what I'm talking about in this book. And in order to do that, we're kind of journeying across different aspects of nature, right? And really, like, what is nature, right? And how is nature intelligent? And how can we commune with that intelligence of nature? And when we do commune with that intelligence of nature, what does it show us, right? When we start to commune with nature, we start to tap into a deeper understanding of the underlying structure and architecture of nature. We start to see into what Stephen Herod Buhner refers to as the imaginal realm, right? The realm of archetype, the realm of myth, seeing the underlying order and architecture of the natural world. And through that, talking about these systems of energetics, right, that are universally a part of different herbal traditions, from the threefold pattern of the principles of alchemy and the doshas of Ayurveda, to the 5 elements, to the 7 planets or the 7 chakras or the 7 tissues of Ayurveda, all these different energetic patterns, really looking at them and saying, how do these energetic patterns relate to people, and how do they relate to plants on a physical, energetic, and spiritual level? Then when we take that understanding of energetics, how do we put it into action, right? How are those principles embodied by these systems of plant medicine? And then how do we put them together in a way that gives us an ability to use plants within this transformational context of healing? And that is ultimately what this vision is behind this book. And I'm very excited about it. I hope you're really excited about it. And I'm wanting to bring you along the journey here. I've got a June 1st deadline to get the final draft in, so I am typing away like crazy up here, and I want to bring you along the journey. So we're going to shoot a video like this, couple videos a month. I'd like to do one a week, hopefully, for you, but sometimes things get busy and I'm not able to. But my goal is to be bringing you along and sharing with you a little bit of what I'm talking about, giving you a little sneak peek behind the scenes, and talk about the book as I go through this process. So thanks so much for checking this out. If you're watching this anywhere but the blog, head on over to evolutionaryherbalism.com and be sure to put your name and email down so you can get updates here whenever we're posting new content on the blog. Or be sure to head on over to our podcast at The Plant Path and subscribe to our podcast where we'll be posting this over there as well. And I just want to say thank you to you all so much again for following the work here, for being a part of the Evolutionary Herbalism community. Please drop me a comment below. Let me know what you think about the book. Let me know what you think about some of the stuff I shared here. And I just always love the feedback and always love to hear from you all. And until next time, take care and be well. We'll see you around. Thank you so much.